Terror hung in the air at the Tower of London like a suffocating fog. Even the most hardened guards couldn't bear to watch as May 19, 1536, dawned. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, knelt on wooden planks that had been hammered together specifically for her death. She was about to make history in the most horrific way possible, becoming the first English queen ever to face the executioner's blade. But here's what they never taught you in school. This wasn't just about getting rid of an unwanted wife. This was a masterfully orchestrated campaign of psychological warfare that would scar her daughter Elizabeth for 6 decades and reshape the entire trajectory of English history. Over the next few minutes, you're going to witness the methodical horror that unfolded across 17 terrifying days, horror that went far beyond the final swing of a French executioner's sword. These details come straight from eyewitness accounts, including letters from the Tower's own constable, revealing disturbing truths that were buried for centuries. Picture this scene, May 2, 1536, at Greenwich Palace. Anne Boleyn sits in the royal viewing box, watching knights clash in the jousting tournament below. As Queen of England, she drops her handkerchief, a simple gesture of favor toward one of the competitors. Henry V witnesses this innocent act and storms away in a rage. Within 24 hours, she's under arrest for adultery, incest, and high treason. But here's where the story takes a sinister turn. Henry had already signed her death warrant before any investigation had even begun. The systematic destruction of Anne Boleyn started with accusations so outrageous that even her sworn enemies refused to believe them. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, built a case that accused Anne of sleeping with 5 different men, including her own brother George. Think about the calculated cruelty of that. They literally fabricated incest charges to guarantee her execution. The so-called evidence came from a court musician named Mark Smeaton, who confessed only after being stretched on the torture rack for 24 straight hours. The other 4 accused men, including her brother, maintained their innocence even as they prepared for their own deaths. But wait until you hear how sloppily they constructed these lies. The legal documents claimed Anne committed adultery on specific dates when royal records prove she was in completely different locations. On May 13, 1535, she was supposedly engaged in adultery at Greenwich, except court documents show she was actually at Richmond Palace, over 10 miles away. They didn't even bother making their fabrications believable because they knew the outcome was already decided. The imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis, and remember, this man despised Anne Boleyn with every fiber of his being. Even he wrote to Emperor Charles V, admitting the charges were based on assumptions and vague suspicions without any real proof or confession. When your worst enemy admits you're being framed, you know something deeply wrong is happening. Here's the truly chilling detail most people never realize. Henry VIII wasn't acting from blind fury. This was calculated, methodical destruction. On April 24th, just 8 days before Anne's arrest, Henry signed a commission granting Cromwell unlimited authority to investigate and prosecute anyone at court. Cromwell later boasted that he had been specifically authorized and commissioned by the king to prosecute and bring the mistress's trial to an end. Those were his exact words: bring to an end, not investigate, not determine guilt or innocence, but end it. If you're discovering information about Tudor England you've never heard before, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below and hit that subscribe button because I'm uncovering the real truth behind palace walls in an entire series on Tudor conspiracies. Now, let me tell you about the psychological torture that began the moment Anne entered the tower. They didn't throw her into some filthy dungeon cell. No, they did something far more twisted and cruel. They locked her in the exact same luxurious apartments where she had stayed before her coronation just 3 years earlier. Imagine being surrounded by the same tapestries, the same furniture, the same windows where you had once prepared to become queen, now preparing to die. Sir William Kingston, the Tower Constable, documented everything in letters that survived the centuries. When Anne arrived at the Tower, she asked him whether she would be taken to a dungeon. He told her no, that she would stay in the same lodging where she had prepared for her coronation. At this news, Kingston wrote, she fell into uncontrollable laughter, something she continued doing many times afterward. That wasn't joy. That was a woman's mind beginning to fracture under impossible psychological pressure. The psychological warfare intensified through constant surveillance. Every single word Anne spoke was recorded and reported. They assigned her 4 ladies-in-waiting who were actually spies, including Lady Kingston, the constable's own wife. These women reported everything: Her dreams, her prayers, her desperate attempts to understand what was happening to her. Anne would pace through her rooms, alternating between hysterical laughter and uncontrollable sobbing. At one point, she told Kingston that she had heard she was accused of being with 3 men, and she could say nothing but deny it unless she should open her body for examination. She was literally offering to undergo physical inspection to prove her innocence. That's how desperate and broken she had become. But the cruelest torture was how they manipulated her hope. They kept changing her execution date, forcing her to prepare for death multiple times. Originally scheduled for May 18th, they postponed it to May 19th without any explanation. Anne had spent the entire night of the 17th in prayer, preparing her soul, saying her final goodbyes mentally. Then sunrise came, and nothing happened. Kingston reported that she seemed desperately eager to be executed by that point. They had broken her so completely that death appeared to be mercy. Throughout those 17 days in the tower, Anne kept asking about her beloved brother George and her father. She couldn't comprehend that George was imprisoned in the same tower, awaiting his own execution, and that her father, Thomas Boleyn, had completely abandoned her to save his own skin. No family member tried to defend her. No friend spoke up. She was utterly alone, surrounded by enemies and spies, waiting to die. The trial itself on May 15th was pure theatrical performance. But here's what will truly shock you. On the morning of Anne's trial, before it even began, Henry told Jane Seymour that Anne would be condemned that day. He was already planning their wedding while his current wife was on trial for her life. The jury wasn't just biased. It was systematically packed with Anne's personal enemies. 27 peers sat in judgment, including her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, who presided over the entire proceedings. Yes, you heard that correctly. Her uncle pronounced her death sentence. The jury included Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, who had openly called Anne a goggle-eyed whore. It included Henry Percy, Anne's former lover, whom she had been forced to abandon years earlier. It included multiple relatives of Jane Seymour, the woman who would replace Anne as queen just 11 days after the execution. They might as well have carved "guilty" into the courtroom walls before she walked in. Anne received no legal counsel. She wasn't told the specific charges until she stood before the court. She had no opportunity to call witnesses in her defense. The prosecution presented no physical evidence and called no live witnesses. The entire case rested on written statements and hearsay. Yet when her uncle asked for the verdict, all 27 peers declared her guilty. Every single one. Now, here's where the story takes an even darker turn. The method of execution became another form of psychological torture. Burning alive was the traditional punishment for adultery and treason committed by a queen. But Henry, in what he presented as an act of mercy, changed this to beheading. Except there was a catch. He insisted on bringing in a special executioner from France, an expert swordsman from Calais. This meant more delays, more psychological torture as Anne waited for her specially imported executioner to arrive. Why a French swordsman? On the surface, it seemed merciful. Death by sword was quicker and cleaner than the axe. But I believe Henry had another motive. Using a French executioner sent a message that Anne was so outside English law, so beyond redemption, that even her execution required foreign hands. It was one final humiliation, one last way to mark her as other, as not truly English, despite being queen. The execution morning itself, May 19th, revealed Anne's complete psychological transformation. Witnesses described her as almost ethereal, dressed in a gray damask gown trimmed with ermine, her hair tucked under a simple cap. The woman who had once blazed through court like a dark star was now pale, composed, almost translucent. She had moved beyond fear into a strange state of acceptance that unnerved everyone present. On the scaffold, Anne gave a speech that historians still debate today. She praised Henry as a gentle and sovereign lord and asked people to pray for him. Some interpret this as Stockholm Syndrome, others as a desperate attempt to protect her daughter Elizabeth. But listen to her exact words. She prayed God would save the king and send him long to reign, calling him the most gentle and merciful prince who had ever lived, saying that to her he had always been a good, gentle, and sovereign lord. The sarcasm was so thick you could cut it with that French sword. But then came the moment that haunts me most. Anne turned to her ladies and said she had heard the executioner was very skilled, and she had such a little neck. She put her hands around her throat and laughed. That's not gallows humor. That's a woman who had been so thoroughly broken that she was making jokes about her own beheading. The crowd fell completely silent. The French executioner was indeed skilled. As Anne knelt upright in the French style, not bent over a block, she kept looking around, waiting for the blow. The executioner had hidden his sword under the straw. While Anne was distracted by his assistant, he struck with one clean cut. Witnesses said her lips continued moving in prayer for several minutes after her head was severed. Whether that was remaining consciousness or just muscle contractions, we'll never know, but that image of Anne's lips still moving in prayer after death burned itself into the collective memory of everyone present. Here's the part that really shows the complete cruelty of it all. They hadn't even prepared a proper coffin. Anne's sobbing ladies had to wrap her head and body in white cloth and place them in an old arrow chest they found in the Tower Armory. The first Queen of England to be executed was buried in a box meant for weapons, dumped in an unmarked grave in the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula. No funeral, no prayers, no marker, as if she had never existed. But the horror didn't end with Anne's death. Let me tell you what this did to her daughter. Elizabeth was 2 years old when her mother was executed. At 8, after watching her stepmother Catherine Howard meet the same fate on the same spot, Elizabeth declared she would never marry. She kept that vow for the rest of her life. The Virgin Queen's refusal to marry, which defined her entire reign, was born in the shadow of that scaffold. Elizabeth could never publicly acknowledge her mother. Anne had been declared a traitor and adulteress. But in private, she wore a ring her entire adult life that contained hidden portraits of herself and Anne Boleyn, positioned face to face. When the ring was finally removed from her finger after death, courtiers discovered this secret she had carried for decades. She also kept her mother's Book of Hours, her jewelry, and even displayed Anne's falcon badge in her palaces when she thought no one would notice. But here's what really reveals the psychological damage: Elizabeth's relationship with execution itself. Unlike her father, who killed at will, unlike her sister Mary, who burned hundreds, Elizabeth agonized over every death warrant. When Parliament demanded Mary, Queen of Scots' execution, Elizabeth delayed for months. After finally signing the warrant, she claimed her advisors had tricked her. Some historians call this political theater, but I see a woman haunted by her mother's ghost, terrified of becoming the monster her father was. The execution of Anne Boleyn did more than remove an inconvenient queen. It fundamentally broke the English understanding of justice. Here was proof that law meant nothing if you displeased the king. Evidence could be fabricated, juries could be packed, even the sacred bond of marriage, blessed by God according to their beliefs, could be destroyed by royal whim. If the queen herself could be subjected to judicial murder, what hope did anyone else have? This precedent claimed its next victim just 6 years later. Catherine Howard, Anne's young cousin, was executed on the same Tower Green on charges just as fabricated. The machinery of royal destruction that killed Anne Boleyn had become a well-oiled system by then. People knew the script: arrest, imprisonment in the Tower, packed jury, predetermined verdict, execution. The only variable was the method. Catherine got the axe instead of the sword. But I haven't told you the worst part yet. Remember Mark Smeaton, the musician whose tortured confessions started this entire nightmare? He was the only one of the accused men who confessed, and he was the only one from a common background. The 4 gentlemen, including George Boleyn, maintained their innocence to the end and died with noble dignity. But Smeaton, he disappeared into historical silence after his confession, executed without fanfare, his family destroyed, his name forever linked with lies extracted by torture. Those 17 days in May 1536 revealed the true horror of Tudor power. Not the public executions meant to terrify; those were theater everyone understood. The real horror was the systematic perversion of justice, the psychological destruction of the victim. Anne's own uncle pronounced her death sentence. Her father didn't lift a finger to save her. The entire English establishment collaborated in killing a woman they knew was innocent. International reaction was immediate and damning. The French were so appalled that Lancelot de Carle, secretary to their ambassador, wrote a 1,318-line poem about Anne's execution within 2 weeks. Henry was so disturbed by this account spreading through Europe that he ordered his ambassador in Paris to suppress it. Even in an age of brutal politics, Europe was shocked that a king would execute his queen on such obviously fabricated charges. The Spanish ambassador Chapuis, despite loathing Anne, wrote to Emperor Charles V that people were murmuring about the proceedings. That's diplomatic speak for everyone knows this was murder. Foreign courts began to reconsider their dealings with a king who could kill his wife so easily. The execution damaged England's reputation across Europe, marking Henry VIII as dangerously unstable. But perhaps the most chilling aspect is how quickly it all happened. 17 days from accusation to execution. 17 days to destroy a woman who had been Queen of England, who had worn the crown, who had been anointed with holy oil in Westminster Abbey. The speed wasn't just about efficiency. It was designed to prevent any organized defense, any second thoughts, any intervention from those who might have helped her. Modern historians have proven beyond doubt that Anne was innocent. The dates don't match. The accusers were tortured or coerced. The jury was packed. The evidence was fabricated. Even at the time, nobody really believed the charges, but that wasn't the point. The point was to demonstrate that Henry VIII's will was absolute, that marriage meant nothing, that even queens could be destroyed when they became inconvenient. Anne Boleyn's execution stands as one of history's starkest examples of judicial murder, but it also, in a twisted way, created England's greatest monarch. Elizabeth I's legendary 45-year reign, her defeat of the Spanish Armada, her transformation of England into a major power, all of it was shaped by the trauma of her mother's death. The Virgin Queen who refused to marry, who ruled with calculated brilliance, who turned England into a maritime empire, was forged in the horror of May 19, 1536. Would Elizabeth have become such an extraordinary ruler without that childhood trauma? Would she have developed that steel spine, that ability to survive in a world of male power, without the example of her mother's destruction? We'll never know. But we do know this. Anne's death created the very thing Henry VIII feared most, a daughter who would surpass him in every way, who would rule longer, more successfully, and be remembered far more fondly than the king who killed her mother. The Tower of London still stands, of course. Tourists walk through those same rooms where Anne spent her final days, take photos on Tower Green where the scaffold stood. There's a glass memorial there now, listing all who died on that spot. But you can't capture the horror in tourist attractions. You can't convey the systematic destruction of a human being, the perversion of justice, the collaboration of an entire system in judicial murder. What happened to Anne could happen to anyone when power decides law doesn't matter, when evidence can be fabricated, when juries can be packed, when the verdict is decided before the trial begins. Justice dies just as surely as the victim on the scaffold. That's the real horror of Anne Boleyn's execution. Not just that an innocent woman died, but that an entire nation watched it happen and did nothing. The French executioner was paid £23 for his work, about £8,000 in today's money. That's what it cost to kill a Queen of England. But the real price was paid by English justice, by every person who lived in fear of royal power, by a small girl named Elizabeth who grew up knowing her mother's fate. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if this hidden history fascinated you, make sure to subscribe for more suppressed historical truths. The story of the Tudors is far darker than anything they taught us in school, and I'm just getting started uncovering the truth.